The year was 1643, and the air in London was thick with tension. On a warm June day, a summons was issued by Parliament, calling for an assembly of learned and godly divines to gather and settle the future of the Church of England. The stakes were high, and the atmosphere was charged with the weight of history. Among those summoned was a man named Daniel Featley, a clergyman known for his sharp tongue and unwavering commitment to the established church. Featley was no stranger to controversy. He had already made a name for himself as a fierce defender of the Church of England against both Catholicism and Protestant sectarianism. But this new summons was different. It was a call to a gathering that could reshape the very fabric of the church he had dedicated his life to. The assembly, known as the Westminster Assembly, was meant to refine orthodoxy and address the growing tensions between the established church and the Puritans who sought to reform it. When the summons arrived, Featley faced a difficult decision. Many of his fellow clergymen, loyal to the king and the episcopacy, declined their invitations. They saw the assembly as a threat to the established order and a violation of the king's authority. But Featley, despite his reservations, decided to attend. His reasons were complex and deeply personal. Daniel Featley was a man of many battles. He had already clashed with Puritans in the 1620s, labeling them antinomians for their perceived laxity in moral discipline. He had also engaged in heated debates with Catholics, using his knowledge of patristic tradition to defend the Reformed faith. Featley was a scholar, a polemicist, and a man who believed deeply in the importance of tradition and the authority of the Church Fathers. When the summons arrived, Featley was torn. On one hand, he was loyal to the king and the episcopacy. On the other hand, he was a man of principle who believed that the church needed to address the growing divisions and find a way to unite. He saw the assembly as an opportunity to influence the direction of the church and to ensure that the Reformed faith remained strong and true. Featley's decision to attend the assembly was not taken lightly. He knew that it would be a contentious gathering and that his presence might be seen as a betrayal by some of his loyalist friends. But he also believed that his voice could make a difference. He saw the assembly as a chance to bridge the gap between the Puritans and the established church, to find a middle ground that could preserve the unity of the church while addressing the legitimate concerns of the reformers. On July 1st, 1643, Featley joined the other divines at Westminster Abbey. The assembly was a diverse group with members from different theological backgrounds and varying degrees of commitment to the established order. Featley was assigned to the Second Standing Committee, responsible for revising the 39 Articles, and to a committee tasked with investigating antinomianism. He threw himself into the debates using his knowledge of patristic tradition to argue for the importance of the creeds and the imputation of Christ's active obedience in justification. Despite his best efforts, Featley soon found himself at odds with many of his fellow assembly members. While he shared their commitment to the Reformed faith, he differed in his approach to tradition and the role of the Church Fathers. The other divines, more focused on the authority of Scripture, often dismissed Featley's reliance on patristic sources. This tension came to a head when Featley gave a speech opposing the Solemn League and Covenant, a document that sought to bind the Church of England to the Scottish Presbyterian model. Featley's speech was met with a mixture of respect and skepticism. Some assembly members appreciated his principled stance, while others saw it as a threat to the unity they were trying to achieve. The debates were intense, and Featley found himself increasingly isolated. Despite this, he continued to speak his mind, determined to stand by his convictions. As the assembly progressed, the divisions between Featley and his fellow divines grew wider. Featley's commitment to the episcopacy and the established church made him an outsider in a gathering that was increasingly dominated by Puritans. His speeches, while well-reasoned and grounded in tradition, often fell on deaf ears. The other divines saw him as a barrier to the reforms they sought to implement. In the end, Featley's participation in the assembly came to a bitter end. He was dismissed and eventually imprisoned, a victim of the political and theological tensions that had defined the gathering. As he sat in his cell, reflecting on the events that had led to his downfall, Featley could not help but wonder if he had made the right decision. But even in his darkest moments, he remained committed to the principles that had guided him throughout his life. As the assembly continued its work, Featley's absence was felt. The debates and decisions that followed would shape the future of the Church of England, and Featley's role in those early days would be remembered as a crucial, if controversial, moment in the history of the Reformation. But for Featley, the road ahead was uncertain. He had stood by his convictions, and now he would have to face the consequences. The story of his participation in the Westminster Assembly was far from over, and the battles he had fought were only the beginning of a much larger struggle. In the summer of 1643, Daniel Featley, a prominent clergyman, made a significant decision that would shape his future and the course of the English Civil War. Featley, known for his strong royalist and Episcopalian views, surprisingly sided with the parliamentarians. This decision has been the subject of much debate among historians who have tried to understand what motivated him to take such a dramatic step. Thomas Fuller, a contemporary of Featley, believed that Featley's heart remained with the Royalists, even as his body attended the Parliamentarian Assembly. Fuller thought Featley was simply trying to show his loyalty to the king while being forced to attend the assembly. Peter Hylan, another historian, suggested that Featley joined the assembly to showcase his abilities, lead a party, or because of his deep-rooted love for Calvinism. Edward Hyde, on the other hand, argued that Featley's attendance was driven by a sense of conscience and a desire to prevent the excesses of the parliamentarians. However, these interpretations were colored by the writer's own biases and the post-Restoration context in which they wrote. For example, Hylan, who was critical of Reformed theology, saw Featley's actions through the lens of his own anti-Calvinist views. Fuller and Hyde, both Royalists, minimized Featley's decision to align with the parliamentarians, suggesting that a true Royalist would never voluntarily associate with the opposition. To understand Featley's decision, we need to look at the events leading up to the summer of 1643. From 1641 to 1643, Featley witnessed the growing power of the parliamentarians and the marginalization of Royalists and Episcopacy. In March 1641, Featley was part of the Williams Committee, a group of Reformed Episcopalians and moderate Presbyterians tasked with addressing concerns about church polity and ceremonies. Despite initial promise, the committee was dissolved by Parliament within a few weeks, signaling the beginning of a more confrontational approach. The situation worsened in January 1642, when King Charles I fled London for Oxford, effectively reinforcing the divisions between the Royalists and parliamentarians. This move weakened the Royalist position, and by October 1642, several Royalist ministers, including Featley's colleagues, were imprisoned. On December 2nd, a committee was formed to identify malignant, scandalous, and seditious ministers in London, with the intention of removing them from their positions. Featley himself faced two attacks on his life in November 1642 and February 1643, and in March 1643 he was reported to the Committee of Plundered Ministers for introducing Laudian innovations into his church. If found guilty, Featley would have lost his ministerial positions and livings. In June 1643, Parliament issued a summons for the Westminster Assembly, and Featley was invited to attend. He took his seat at the Assembly on July 1st, just days before his trial was to begin. His participation in the Assembly seems to have been a turning point, as he was acquitted of all charges on July 11th. The MP Lawrence Whittaker noted that Featley's favorable outcome was due to his good deserts to the church heretofore and his participation in the assembly. Feeling the pressure of the times, Featley likely accepted the assembly invitation to avoid imprisonment and the loss of his livings. He was deeply attached to his positions, and the prospect of losing them was devastating. In his own words, he described the sequestration of his benefices as making him twice dead and plucked up by the roots. Featley's decision was a pragmatic one, aimed at preserving his livelihood and influence. Despite his participation in the assembly, Featley never fully embraced the parliamentarian cause. In his writings from prison, he justified his decision based on the circumstances at the time, but he also expressed regret. He claimed that he joined the assembly only as long as it aligned with established church orthodoxy and practice, and he often wished he could leave. Featley's nephew John Featley noted that his uncle's speech against the Solemn League and Covenant was so unpopular that it led to his persecution, including plundering, sequestration, imprisonment, and ultimately his death. The Westminster Assembly became a litmus test for the political allegiance of Reformed clergy. Those who attended were seen as siding with the parliamentarians, while those who refused were considered loyal to the king. Featley's decision to attend the assembly, even if it was a tactical move, marked a significant shift in his public stance. However, his underlying commitment to episcopacy and the established church remained strong, and his later writings reflect his continued dedication to these principles. In the early 1640s, Featley's political flexibility was part of a broader strategy to navigate the turbulent times. His participation in the Williams Committee in 1641 and his later refutation of Anabaptists in 1645 were both efforts to position himself within the ecclesiastical debates of the period. The Williams Committee, chaired by John Williams, aimed to find a middle ground between the Royalists and parliamentarians, but it ultimately failed to achieve its goals. Featley's involvement in these committees and his later actions demonstrate his willingness to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining his core beliefs. The Williams Committee, with its mix of Reformed Episcopalians and Presbyterians, was a last-ditch effort to find a compromise on church governance. Despite the committee's failure, it highlighted the deep theological and political divisions of the time. Featley's participation in these efforts and his subsequent actions reveal a complex and nuanced figure who was both a product of his times and a shaper of them. The pursuit of unity between Calvinist conformist divines and Puritans seemed promising on the surface. Daniel Featley led an assembly of Puritans and Calvinist conformists who began working on a practical divinity manual. This manual was meant to be translated and used across Europe. In May 1631, George Abbot allowed John Dury to gather signatures for the Instrumentum Theologorum, a document aimed at bringing peace and unity among European churches. By June, Dury had collected signed declarations from 38 divines, including prominent figures like Featley, Richard Sibbes, and John Davenport. These divines believed that practical divinity could be a unifying topic. Featley was also part of a broader movement to unite Reformed churches across Europe. A letter from the Herborn Synod in Germany, dated January 10, 1633, expressed hope for the union of the churches and the abolition of the schism. The letter was addressed to English divines, including Featley and others, praising them for their doctrine and piety. Discussions about changing the English church government were driven by the desire to achieve unity within the established church. The goal was to create ecclesiastical structures that would be acceptable to continental divines. The English divines believed that any changes should not scandalize churches abroad and should satisfy both parties at home, ensuring that the new structures would be durable and supported by both the ecclesiastic and the parliament. Despite this pursuit of unity, there were significant disagreements among the committee members about church polity. Some, like James Ussher, supported a reduced episcopacy, where bishops served as superintendents over other ministers. Ussher's ideas were already circulating in manuscript form, though he was hesitant to present them officially to avoid conflict. Joseph Hall, on the other hand, argued for jure divino episcopacy, believing that Scripture mandated that bishops should rule the church. Others advocated for Presbyterianism. The underlying divisions within the committee were evident. 3 members, including Stephen Marshall, Edmund Calamy, Thomas Young, Matthew Newcomen, and William Spurstow, formed the Smectum Nuus group and published pamphlets refuting Hall's works. Despite these disagreements, the committee tried to present a united front, and none of the conflicting members were listed on the title page of the committee's official proceedings. Featley's views on church government were most closely aligned with Ussher's. He believed that a church could exist without a bishop, but not without a priest or pastor. He argued that while episcopacy was an apostolic institution, it was not the only legitimate form of church government. Featley defended episcopacy as a legitimate form of church government, but sought to qualify the term prelacy when it was associated with popery and superstition. He believed that episcopacy could be reformed and preserved as a legitimate form of church government. The committee's official proceedings refuted the main Laudian innovations, such as turning the table altar-wise and receiving communion at the rails. However, some members like Featley conformed to these changes to preserve their ecclesiastical positions. This conformity was seen by many as a betrayal of true orthodoxy. When the Committee of Plundered Ministers tried Featley in 1643, he nearly lost his livings due to his conformity to Laudianism. The committee's efforts to reverse the Laudian reforms were not just about restoring the church, but also about demonstrating their opposition to Laud. By taking a strong stand against Laudianism, they hoped to make amends for their former actions and provide a safety net if mediation failed. Featley's political flexibility allowed him to emphasize opposition to a more robustly conformist position before the Westminster Assembly, and later champion his affirmation of conformity. The subcommittee's work was interrupted by the Root and Branch Bill and the diminishing political support from Parliament. Thomas Fuller believed that the committee's moderation and mutual compliance might have prevented the fall of episcopacy and the Civil War. The committee's failure to address the theological diversity within its ranks and to craft an ecclesiastical proposal that all divines could agree on led to its breakdown. The Presbyterian members of the Williams Committee, who were involved in imprisoning Featley following his dismissal from the Westminster Assembly, further highlight the deep divisions. Featley's final weeks at the Assembly were marked by a plot to silence or dismiss him. A felter named Armiger Wardner befriended Featley and relayed a message from James Ussher, claiming that Charles I was offended by Featley's participation in the Assembly. Featley, torn between his loyalty to the monarchy and his commitment to the Assembly, agreed to send a note to Ussher through Wardner. Unbeknownst to Featley, Wardner was a supporter of the new Reformation and had fabricated the message to entrap Featley. Wardner showed Featley's note to the committee, accusing him of being a royalist spy. On September 30th, 1643, Featley was imprisoned in Lord Peter's house in Aldersgate Street. His books were seized, his goods were plundered, and his livings were sequestered. Featley's account of these events portrays him as an innocent victim, duped by Wardner. However, his pursuit of reassurance from Wardner suggests he was aware of the risks. Even after his arrest, Featley continued to plead ignorance, highlighting his political flexibility and the challenges he faced in navigating the turbulent times. Daniel Featley found himself in a tricky situation during the turbulent times of the English Civil War. Whether Charles I or James Ussher actually sent a message to Featley is uncertain, but Featley's response to what he believed was a royal message revealed a lot about his loyalty and fears. Featley was a royalist, meaning he supported the king, and he knew that attending an assembly called by Parliament rather than the king was a risky move. This is why he was alarmed by the message. Instead of admitting his mistake, he tried to get Charles's permission to stay at the assembly, hoping to avoid trouble. After being imprisoned in 1644, Featley wrote two anonymous books, Sacra Nemesis and The Gentle Lash, to defend himself against the accusations. He claimed that his note to Usher was innocent and that it only contained information about recent decisions made at the assembly. Featley argued that since the law against sending messages to Oxford hadn't been passed yet, he hadn't done anything wrong. He also suggested that the letter was intercepted and tampered with, which made him look bad. Featley believed that parliamentarians targeted him because they wanted his well-located and valuable church positions. He said that members of the assembly were jealous of his livings, and that some of them even took his positions after he was imprisoned. Featley insisted he was not a spy, and that parliamentarians had already decided that anyone who wrote to Oxford was automatically a spy. To strengthen his case, Featley included letters from respected Reformed Protestant leaders from other countries. These letters praised Featley's work and vouched for his character. For example, John Stables wrote that it was unfair for someone who had been such a strong advocate for religion to be treated so poorly. Featley also mentioned that he had been offered a prestigious position at Leiden University, but declined due to his age and health. Featley emphasized his commitment to the Reformed faith and his loyalty to the king. He pointed out that he had been chosen to be a member of the Westminster Assembly and had been commissioned by Parliament to respond to a Catholic priest's work. Featley's response, Vertumnus Romanus, was meant to counter the priest's arguments and show that Catholics could not use their religion to avoid the law. Featley's opposition to the Solemn League and Covenant, an agreement between the English Parliament and the Scots to reform the Church, was a key reason for his imprisonment. He argued that by subscribing to the Covenant, he and others would be breaking their previous vows to the king and the established church. Featley believed that the Covenant put the rights of Parliament before the king's authority, which he saw as a violation of his duty as a loyal subject. Even though Featley made some compromises to avoid losing his position, his core beliefs remained unchanged. He stood by his opposition to the Covenant and his defense of the monarchy. Featley claimed that he was not the one being disobedient, but the Covenanters who were breaking their vows to the king and the church. In his posthumous work, The League Illegal, Featley further defended the idea that the king was the supreme head of the church and the state. He argued that no one could enter into a public covenant to reform religion without the king's consent. Featley grounded his argument in Scripture, especially Romans chapter 13, verse 1, which emphasized the importance of obeying the government. He believed that the covenant was not supported by the Bible and that loyal subjects could refuse to sign it without compromising their conscience. Throughout his writings, Featley portrayed himself as a defender of the true Reformed faith and the monarchy, even in the face of significant opposition. His efforts to clear his name and defend his actions reveal the complex and often dangerous political and religious landscape of the English Civil War. Daniel Featley, a prominent English clergyman, was a staunch defender of the established church and its practices. One of his main arguments was in favor of episcopacy, the system where bishops lead the church. Featley believed that the church thrived when it was governed by bishops, and that throughout history, those who opposed this structure, like the heretic Arius, were often wrong. He thought that if the church was having problems under episcopacy, it was because of the people, not the system itself. To support his view, Featley pointed to other Reformed churches in Europe that also had hierarchical structures, such as those in Poland, Transylvania, Denmark, and Sweden. He even cited examples from universities where leaders had authority over students and fellows, similar to how bishops should lead the church. Featley was not entirely inflexible, though he acknowledged that episcopacy could be abolished, but only through a lawful process, such as a bill passed by Parliament and approved by the king. This was a subtle critique of the parliamentarians who were trying to change the church's structure without following proper procedures. In 1645, while in prison, Featley wrote one of his most famous works, The Dippers Dipped, which attacked English Baptists. Baptists, also known as Anabaptists, were a group that rejected infant baptism and believed only adults who could profess their faith should be baptized. Featley saw them as heretics and argued that their beliefs were long condemned by both the Greek and Latin churches. He used a debate he had with a prominent Baptist minister, William Kiffin, to highlight the errors in Baptist doctrine. Featley claimed that Baptists were not only wrong about baptism, but also held other dangerous beliefs that could lead to chaos and disorder. Featley's work was not just a personal attack. It was part of a broader effort to defend what he saw as true orthodoxy. He used historical and theological arguments to show that the Baptist movement was not a legitimate part of the true church. He pointed to the practices of the early church and the consensus of Reformed churches to argue that infant baptism was essential. Featley's approach was to show that Baptists were outside the historical and theological tradition of the church, making them heretics. Despite his harsh criticism, Featley's work had a significant impact. It influenced other writers and helped shape the arguments against Baptists in the 1640s and beyond. The Baptists, in response, made revisions to their own confession of faith to address some of Featley's critiques. The debate between Featley and the Baptists was not just about baptism. It was a struggle over who had the right to define the true church and its practices. Featley's arguments were rooted in his belief that the church should be governed by tradition and that deviations from this tradition were dangerous. He saw himself as a protector of the true faith, using his knowledge of history and theology to combat what he saw as heresy. His work, The Dippers Dipped, was a powerful tool in this battle, and it continued to be influential long after it was written. Daniel Featley was a man who lived in a time of great religious and political turmoil in England. He was a minister and a scholar who often found himself in the middle of heated debates about what true Christianity should look like. One of his most significant works was a book called Christianismus Redivivus, where he challenged the ideas of other prominent ministers like Stephen Marshall, Richard Baxter, and Daniel Featley's own namesake, the Catholic priest John Featley. In his book, Featley argued that the true church should be based on the teachings of the Bible, not on traditions that had been passed down over the years. He pointed out that his opponent, Dr. Daniel Featley, had once argued that the truth of a church should be judged by its doctrine, not by its history or traditions. Featley cleverly used Dr. Featley's own words to show that the Anabaptists, a group of Christians who believed in adult baptism, should also be judged by their doctrine, not by their history. Henry Dehn, another opponent of Dr. Featley, also challenged his reliance on tradition. Dehn claimed that Dr. Featley had privately admitted that some of the traditions he defended were not as reliable as he publicly claimed. This showed that Featley's emphasis on tradition was sometimes more of a strategy to win arguments than a deeply held belief. As the years went on, Featley's views on tradition became more pronounced, especially when he was debating with Anabaptists and at the Westminster Assembly, a gathering of religious leaders. He argued that the established church should be defended using tradition, even though he had previously criticized others for overvaluing tradition. This shift was partly because he wanted to align himself with the Presbyterians, a group of Protestants who were strong opponents of the Anabaptists. Featley's approach was not just about theology. It was also about survival. He was a conformist, meaning he followed the rules of the established church, but he also had strong Calvinist beliefs. He tried to position himself as a moderate, someone who could bridge the gap between different groups. For example, he wrote a book called The Dippers Dipped that harshly criticized the Anabaptists, hoping to gain favor with the Presbyterians. However, his attacks on the Anabaptists also allowed him to subtly criticize the parliamentarians, who were challenging the authority of the king. Despite his efforts, Featley's attempts to navigate the political and religious landscape were not always successful. He was imprisoned by Parliament for his refusal to support the Solemn League and Covenant, a document that aimed to unite the Scottish and English churches. Even in prison, he continued to write and publish works that criticized his opponents, including the Anabaptists and the parliamentarians. In his final months, Featley's health declined, and he was transferred to Chelsea College, where he hoped the fresh air would help him recover. However, he did not get better, and he died on April 17, 1645, surrounded by his family. His funeral was attended by his longtime friend William Lowe, who delivered a sermon that praised Featley's contributions to the church and his defense of the Protestant faith. Featley's life and work reflect the complex and often contradictory nature of religious and political debates in 17th century England. He was a man who tried to balance his deep religious convictions with the need to survive in a time of great upheaval. His legacy as a defender of the Reformation and a vigorous debater is remembered in the many works he left behind and the impact he had on the religious landscape of his time. Daniel Featley was a man of deep faith and strong opinions, which often put him at odds with the political and religious turmoil of his time. As a minister, he was known for his eloquence and his unwavering commitment to the Church of England, even as the country was torn apart by the English Civil War. Featley's life and writings offer a window into the complex world of 17th century England, where religious beliefs and political loyalties were often intertwined. In 1640, Featley found himself in the midst of a heated debate over the structure of the church. The Williams Committee, a group of learned divines tasked with discussing the future of the church, was a microcosm of the broader conflict between those who supported the traditional episcopal system and those who favored a more Presbyterian model. Featley, a staunch defender of episcopacy, was one of the committee members who argued that the church should retain its hierarchical structure. His views were not universally accepted, and the committee's deliberations were often marked by intense disagreements. One of Featley's key allies in these debates was Lady Anne Southwell, a respected poet and devout Anglican. Their friendship, which likely began during Featley's time as a minister at Acton, was a source of mutual support and inspiration. Southwell's affection for Featley is evident in her commonplace book, where she refers to him as our beloved Dr. Featley. This personal connection echoes the importance of personal relationships in the religious and political landscape of the time. As the tensions between Parliament and the monarchy escalated, Featley's position became increasingly precarious. In 1641, the parliamentarians began to take more aggressive actions against those who opposed their reforms. Featley was one of the royalist ministers who faced charges for opposing Parliament. Despite the risks, he remained a vocal critic of the parliamentary agenda, particularly their efforts to abolish the Book of Common Prayer and the episcopal system. Featley's writings during this period reflect his deep concerns about the direction of the church. In The Gentle Lash, he defended the traditional practices of the church and criticized the radical changes proposed by the parliamentarians. He argued that the divines called by the act were meant to be consulted, not to make final decisions, a point that he emphasized in his correspondence and publications. The political climate only worsened in the following years. In 1642, Featley found himself caught in the crossfire of the growing conflict. He was accused of being an enemy of Parliament. and was even subjected to physical violence by parliamentary soldiers who plundered his property at Acton and Lambeth. Despite these challenges, Featley continued to write and speak out, using his position as a minister to advocate for the church's traditional structure. One of Featley's most significant works during this period was Sacra Nemesis, a treatise that detailed the wrongs he perceived in the actions of Parliament. In this work, he accused the parliamentarians of undermining the authority of the church and the monarchy. He also wrote The League Illegal, a critique of the Solemn League and Covenant, which he saw as a dangerous and unconstitutional agreement that threatened the stability of the nation. Featley's views were not isolated. He was part of a broader network of royalist and Episcopalian divines who were working to defend the church and the monarchy. One of his contemporaries, James Ussher, the Archbishop of Armagh, was another prominent figure who argued for a modified form of episcopacy. Ussher's work, The Reduction of Episcopacy, was a significant contribution to the debate, and it influenced many of the discussions within the Williams Committee. The political and religious landscape of 17th-century England was marked by a diversity of opinions and a deep sense of division. Featley's experiences and writings provide a valuable perspective on this tumultuous period. His unwavering commitment to the Church of England and his resistance to the parliamentary reforms highlight the complex interplay of faith and politics in a time of great upheaval. As the English Civil War raged on, Featley's life and work continued to be shaped by the conflict. His writings, such as Dippers, Dipped, a critique of the Baptist movement, reflect his broader concerns about the rise of religious radicalism. Featley saw these new religious groups as a threat to the established order and the unity of the church. Despite the challenges he faced, Featley remained a prominent figure in the religious debates of his time. His legacy is a testament to the enduring importance of faith and tradition in the face of political and social change. His writings and actions provide a vivid portrait of a man who was deeply committed to his beliefs, even in the most difficult of times. After the death of Daniel Featley in 1645, his story didn't end. Instead, it was retold and reshaped by those who remembered him, especially by his nephew, John Featley. These stories, written after the monarchy was restored in 1660, painted Featley as a loyal supporter of the king and the established church, even in his final moments. This chapter explores how Featley's legacy was crafted and what it tells us about the times in which these stories were written. When Daniel Featley was on his deathbed, he prayed for the return of the monarchy and the protection of the church. His last words, as told by his nephew Henry, were a plea for the church which he believed was being torn apart. This image of Featley as a devoted royalist and churchman was carefully constructed by his family and supporters to fit the political and religious climate of the 1660s. Historians have long debated how much we can trust these posthumous accounts. Some argue that these biographies were written with a specific agenda in mind, aiming to support the political and religious views of the writers. For example, John Featley's account of his uncle's life was likely intended to show that even during the turbulent times of the English Civil War, there were loyalists who never wavered in their support for the king and the church. This narrative was particularly useful after the Restoration, when the monarchy and the Church of England were re-established. However, it's also important to recognize that these biographers often had a genuine interest in history and in preserving the legacy of their subjects. They believed that the stories they told were true and that these figures deserved to be remembered for their contributions. John Featley, for instance, wanted to ensure that his uncle's life and work were not forgotten, and he used his account to highlight Featley's unwavering faith and loyalty. One of the most significant events in Featley's life that was retold in different ways was the incident at Lambeth in 1643. During the Civil War, a group of soldiers entered the church where Featley was preaching causing a violent conflict. Royalist accounts, including John Featley's, portrayed the soldiers as the aggressors and Featley as a victim. Parliamentarian accounts, on the other hand, claimed that the parishioners were the ones who instigated the violence. These conflicting stories were used to support each side's narrative during the war and in the years that followed. The way Featley's life was remembered and retold also had a lasting impact on how he was perceived. His posthumous works, such as Dipper's Dipped, continued to be published and discussed, shaping the way people understood his views on baptism and other religious issues. However, over time, the memory of Featley and other Calvinist conformists began to fade, with the exception of figures like James Ussher, whose reputation has endured. In the end, the afterlife of Daniel Featley's legacy shows us how history is often shaped by the perspectives and needs of those who write it. The stories we tell about the past are not just about the people and events they describe, but also about the values and concerns of the present. By examining these accounts, we can gain a deeper understanding of the complex and often conflicting narratives that define our understanding of history.